for a little time to consider Gurnall, Christian and Complete Armour. Now we're been for a number of weeks now, he's been teaching us about the necessity for holiness. And the first area that he dealt with, and we looked at this over 2 Saturday evenings, was the necessity for holiness in worship. We dealt extensively with that. And he gave us 2 particular directives. Be consistent in the ordinances and seek God's goals in worship rather than our own goals, whatever they might be. Well, having spoken about the necessity and nature of holiness in worship, we're now moving on to the next section where he's dealing with holiness in employment. Holiness in employment. And employment here is broad. It refers, obviously, if you're actively employed, but the application is broader than that, and we're all employed in one way or another in the things of this world. But the primary focus is on employment as with an employer and so on. Now, he introduces a topic and then he proceeds to make 4, maybe 5 actual applications, and maybe we'll manage this whole section tonight. We'll see. Well, first of all, his introduction of the topic. Holiness, says Gurnall, must be written on the Christian's vocation as well as on his religious services. That's really, that sums up everything he's going to say in a way. You know, holiness is to be written on our vocation, whether that's active, actual vocation with a company or workplace or whatever, or just our ordinary calling in life, to go about life. Holiness must be written upon it as well as upon his religious services. He stressed the need for holiness in religion, but it mustn't stop there. The construction superintendent who observes the building code is as exact in framing the kitchen as he is the parlor. So each room, it may not be such a public room, it may not be such an important room, but we are to be as exact in our building and in our superintending of it as we are in other things. And so we must be precise in our worldly business as in the duties of worship. And we're reading in 1 Peter that we are to be holy in all manner of conversation. As Gurnall puts it, we must not leave our religion, as some people leave their Bibles on the pew at church. Don't leave your religion in church. Man's most complex ability, the power to reason, guides even his simplest actions, eating, drinking, sleeping. And in a similar way, in the Christian grace, the highest principle is to steer him in all his behavior. He's not to buy or sell or work as a mere man, but as a Christian man. He's not to be like that statesman's robe which was thrown down when the man left his official duties and said, "There, Lord Treasurer," he said as he threw the gown down, "you stay over there for a while." No, wherever the Christian is, whatever he's doing, he must keep holiness on. He must not do anything in which he cannot show he is a Christian. Now, how does all of this apply? So much for introduction. How does all of this apply practically? Well, the power of holiness shines in our prospective callings in several ways. And he begins to give us a number of examples. First of all, be diligent in your calling. Be diligent in your calling. When God calls us to be Christians, he calls us out of the world, but not out of work. I thought that was quite an interesting little summary that he made of it there. He calls us out of the world, but not out of work. It is true, when he called Elisha, he left his plough and the apostles put down their nets. But these men were called to special office in the church. And that's different. But he's speaking here of the private Christian. And it's impossible for you to be holy if you are not diligent in a particular calling. The law of man labels a person a vagrant who doesn't have a place to live. And God's word counts the person disorderly who will not work at whatever calling they have and act for God's glory through it all. 2 Thessalonians 3, we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all. God does not want his people profitable. It does want his people profitable, like sheep which do good to the ground they feed on. Again, I thought that was an interesting little illustration. He wants them to be like sheep which do good to the ground they feed on. Everyone should be better for knowing a Christian. And he gives us the example of Philemon and Onesimus. When Onesimus was converted, he really did become profitable to Paul and to Philemon as well. To Paul as a Christian and to Philemon as a servant. Grace made a diligent servant out of a runaway. An idle believer is a useless believer. And while the man who will not work does no one any good, he hurts himself the most. So if you're to be holy in your calling, be diligent, wherever it is, whether you're in full employment or whether you're maybe retired and it's other things you're doing, or whether you're still in school and that's your calling, doesn't matter. Be diligent. But then secondly, have a tender conscience in your calling. He speaks here about people who are diligent in their calling. And you think, well, that's good. That's what he's just told us to do, isn't it? And Gurnall says, well, yes and no. It's what I've just told you to do, but it's not good because they're not doing it because God commands it. They're doing it because they're going to get some good out of it themselves. It's purely worldly motives that's behind it. And what he seems to be saying in this section is, don't be driven by worldly motives. He gives the example of the shopkeeper who keeps his shop going and he works hard at his shop. Well, good. You've ticked the first box, if you like. But this shop owner, he opens his shop on the Lord's day as well. So his conscience is diligent, but his conscience is not operating as it should. If conscience were the key that closed the shop on Monday, he says, Gurnall, we would also close it on the Lord's day. Some people are like hawks, flying so low after the world's prey that they will not accept God's most precious gifts. Conscience in God's name calls to them to come apart for a while and wait on God for one day. Oh no, they won't even give that. They'll chase the world with greedy diligence. It's plain to see what sends them on the trip. It's not conscience, but it's their own sinful desires. If you want to walk in the power of holiness, yes, you must be diligent, but you must also have a desire to please God in all of it, and your conscience directed in that way. He gives the example of the person saying, this is the place that God has put me. I'm his servant in my shop, and I must serve him as I would have my children serve me, and even more so, for they are not mine as much as I am his. And that's quite a provoking thought, and a thought-provoking comment there. Even more so, they are not mine as much as I am his. Well, be diligent, be directed by your conscience to do what is right in all your diligence and avoid what is wrong. And then thirdly, strive for success. The spider that spins her web out of her own body dwells in it as though she is, it dwells in it when she is through. And the person who operates his own enterprises by his own ingenuity entitles himself to recognition as a self-made man. I just realized I made an error in that heading. Didn't quite make sense to myself when I said strive for success, but it's success with God. Let that be the key to your success. I'll go back to the illustration he gives. The spider spins a web out of her own body and dwells in it when she's finished. It's all the spider's work. And the person who operates his enterprises by his own ingenuity entitles himself to the recognition of being a self-made man. Well, it's very easy for that person to worship his own wisdom than to worship God. There was a man once, says Gurnall, who overheard his neighbour thanking God for the good corn in his field. And he said, "Thank God," he said. "Why, I'd rather thank my manure cart." Well, says Gurnall, that was the speech of a sewer. He says his speech was filthier than the load on his cart. He says, if you want to be a Christian, you must acknowledge God in all your ways and not lean on your own understanding. Proverbs 3:6. That's what will lead you to crown God with praise when success crowns your work. And he gives the example of Jacob, who worked as long and as hard as any other businessman for his wealth. But the foundation of his diligence was prayer and expectation of blessing from heaven, and he attributes that clearly to the Lord himself, if you read, for example, in Genesis 28. So, diligence in your calling, conscience governing your decisions in your calling, seeking success in your calling, but realizing it must come from God and must be attributed to God. Fourthly, holiness in your employment will also have the element of contentment. The element of contentment. Necessity was the heathen schoolmaster to teach contentment. Again, this is a nice comment, isn't it? Necessity was the heathen schoolmaster to teach contentment. They were content because they had no choice, in other words. But faith is the Christian schoolmaster to teach contentment. Faith is what teaches the saint to enjoy the supplies of providence with a sweet complacency as the will of God concerning him. This is godliness that triumphs, he says. When the Christian can carve contentment out of God's providence, no matter what dish it's before him. If he gathers little, he's satisfied with a small meal. If he gathers much, he has no more than his grace can digest and turn into good nourishment. Either way, there's nothing left over to gorge his pride. Paul, Philippians 4, knew how to abound and how to suffer need. If you take away contentment from godliness, you take away, says Gurnall, one of the loveliest gems she wears over her heart. Godliness with contentment is great gain, not godliness with impressive worldly possessions. That's the fourth thing then. You want holiness in your employment, be content. Fifthly, and finally, he says, look out for priority. Priority. Don't let the things of the world become priority. Now, this was touched on earlier in prayer. And Gurnall speaks about this. The world operates with such an encroaching nature that it's hard for us to be friends with it and not be captured and held in bondage. When Abraham showed Hagar more respect than usual, she began to overstep her place with Sarah. And our worldly vocation will nudge out heavenly appointments if we don't keep a strict eye on it. With this in mind, let us examine two important ways to protect the power of holiness. First of all, the Christian does not let his calling, in which he is to be diligent, steal into the things of God. We can watch Satan's plot unfold so easily. Have you noticed it's almost impossible to think about serving God without some excuse pressing itself to put you off? Well, Solomon warns us against the devil's tactic here. He that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. Ecclesiastes 11:4. It's sad that the master must ask the slave what to do. It's sad if the master has to ask the slave what to do. Or if the Christian must take his orders from the world, asking its permission to wait upon God. Holiness in its power, like Samson in his strength, can sever the excuses that would separate him from God as easily as Samson snapped the cords that held him. Holiness frees the saint to make his way into the presence of God, even through the pressing crowd of worldly duties. It's a nice illustration, isn't it? And he quotes David, 1 Chronicles 22. David said, in my trouble I have prepared for the house of God 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver. Well, there must have been dozens of worthy causes in front of David. Military expenses, all these things, demanding money and demanding his resources. Just as Rome showed her confidence by sending help to Spain when Hannibal was at her gates, so David displayed his trust in God by planning to build his temple in a season of national distress. And then secondly, and I'm going to finish with this because our time is going, the Christian does not let his schedule drain his affections for God. The husband deals with different groups of people all day, and he gives his energy and intelligence to each, but nobody on his agenda is loved as much as his wife and children. And when he goes home at night, he takes his love to them as a whole, as it was when he left. In fact, it's a relief for him to be away from the pressures of business, at home again with a family. That's a sweet frame, but it's a hard one to keep. Can you really say, after you've spent an entire day in the profit and loss of the world, that you bring God your whole heart? It's not easy to hold on the word all day and then shake it off. And I'm going to finish with this illustration. The world treats the Christian as a little child treats his mother. And you're saying, what does he mean? Well, he means this. If the child can't stop her leaving, he'll cry to go after her. And if the world can't prevent us from going into service for God, it will whine to be taken along with us. It will whine to be taken along. Isn't that so true? And just, it's a very pleasing little illustration he's got there, isn't it? Well, that completes that section. Holiness in employment. We've seen holiness in worship. Then, if we're spared next time, he'll be moving on to deal with holiness in behavior towards other people. And no doubt we shall look forward to that. But we're going to sing now in Gaelic, in the words of Psalm 103. We're going to sing 2 verses from the beginning, and the tune is Dundee. Psalm 103 at the beginning, Res Salam har a chod fichet ik an hoshoch. O manim biamichusinish, in ye hov amol. Mother gach nifst a yam, and am nervous call. O manim biamich feninish, ye hov amol the year. Not ye when ich nicht chiovakin. The yawning, ucht and hria, she weiss gut gras for kern. Gach pechke gan het vee. She weet goed slaantjes voerstok falls. Of desland you could yes. Maar schon edard, daar aan en raste van Hoshok. O mannen, Jannetjes in is, hier, ik hou amor.
O mannen, Tiolge